Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. Great to have you with us again. My name is Stephen Trainer. I'm joined with Alice downstairs, and we're both running this webinar this morning to talk about the April 8th total solar eclipse. I know a bunch of you have joined some of these webinars before, so this one is going to be a slightly different focus. You'll see some of the same material, but I'm trying to keep this a little bit distinct. And today's topic is really, I wanted to focus on exactly what we need to be expecting to do as photographers of the eclipse on the day, and to talk through in quite a bit of detail that intense period from just before second contact until just after third contact, which is when, for many of us, I think the bulk of our photographic efforts are going to be expended, and that's when some of the most remarkable phenomena of an eclipse are observed. And there's lots to think about. There's lots going on. So we'll talk about that in some detail. I think a bunch of you haven't photographed eclipses before. If this audience is anything like the one from a couple of weeks ago, that was around, I think 60% of people hadn't photographed a total eclipse before. Maybe another 30 had photographed one before, which may have been 2017. And then there are a few more experienced folks in the mix as well. So I would expect that this audience will be similar today. With that, let me tell you a little bit of some of the questions that you asked. So there's some really good questions. Most of them I think I'm going to be able to address this morning. There are a few that were super specific that I probably won't get to, but I'm going to give you some pointers to resources that will give you those answers for the things I can't cover myself. So a lot of questions on filters. What do I need to protect my eyes, to protect my camera? When can I remove it? When should I put it back on? What should I use? So we'll talk about that. A lot of questions around exposure and bracketing and what to do at different moments in the eclipse. And that's really what we're going to focus on this morning. The focus today is around photographing this eclipse with a telephoto lens and doing stills photography. And I'm assuming that the vast majority of you will be using either a digital SLR or a mirrorless camera, or potentially one of the super zoom cameras. So that's what we're going to focus on today. I'm just quickly scanning the list of questions here. There's a whole load of them. A few about location and planning, and we'll look at that a little bit too. So anything I don't get to or that occurs to you, then just fire away in the Q&A section. Okay, so let's look at these slides. So first off, these are some resources. I'll give you these right up front, so you can screenshot this or take a note. I'll show this again at the end. Obviously, we're going to talk about Photo Ephemeris, the Photographer's Ephemeris. That's our software. We have a web app, which is free to use with an optional paid subscription for additional features. We have an iOS app for your iPad or iPhone, and I'll be showing both of those today in conjunction with some of the things we're talking about. Second link there is for Fred Espinak's site, Mr. Eclipse. And I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. He has this wonderful page. It's incredibly concise on photographic technique, how to photograph a total solar eclipse. That's the link on the homepage of that site. And you can have a look through there. It has tables of recommended exposures and settings. And we're not going to review all the possible settings and all the scenarios. There's no way I can do that. I'm going to focus in on just one particular set of settings and talk about how you can adapt that. But if you want to broaden your view of that, have a look at this page. And then thirdly, this book, Photographing Total Solar Eclipses or Eclipses by Alan Dyer. His site is amazingsky.com. It's an excellent book, 400 and something pages long. Covers all sorts of scenarios from the most basic to the most sophisticated. So that is available too, and I would recommend that to you. Let's talk again about eye safety. I show these slides every time. I think it's important that we cover this up front. So for your own eyes and protection, don't look at the sun. without certified solar eclipse eye protection. And I was at another presentation last night, and the presenter said, I don't call them eclipse glasses, I call them solar safety glasses. And that's exactly correct. You can go out today, and if the skies are clear, put them on, look at the sun and observe. You'll probably see some sunspots if you have particularly sharp vision. And you want to look for glasses that are certified to ISO 12312-2 from reputable suppliers. Read the instructions before you use them and inspect them carefully. Make sure they're not damaged in any way. So don't mess around with sunglasses or stacking up filters. You can use welder's glass, but I don't know in this day and age why you would when eclipse glasses are so readily available. So there's a page link at the bottom there to a NASA page on eclipse safety. So I would recommend you look at that if you're not familiar with this topic. Secondly, for your camera, binoculars, telescopes, do you need a solar filter? Yes. It needs to be on the front of the device. So not between the lens and the camera, not on the back of the viewfinder, on the front of the lens at all times, except during totality when it must be removed. Otherwise, you'll see nothing. So if you don't have that on and you keep photographing the uneclipsed sun, you'll probably damage your equipment. Or even worse, your eyesight if you're looking through an optical viewfinder. Don't look through the optical viewfinder, even if there's a filter on, because not all filters are, they might protect your camera, but they won't always protect your eyesight. So that's an important additional consideration. One thing you can't do is have a filter on your camera and your eclipse glasses and then look at your camera, you'll see nothing at all. So if you're looking at, say, the electronic viewfinder on a mirrorless or the screen on the back of your camera, you won't have your eclipse glasses on for that. So chances are you're going to be taking your eclipse glasses on and off during the event. As you look up to the sun, you need them on. As you look back to your camera, you'll need to take them off, but you'll need to keep your camera protected. So forget about UV protective filters and ND filters, your standard sort of UV cut type filter, polarizers, ND grads, all of that stuff. That's not going to do it. We'll talk about what you can use. Okay, let's just jump into the terminology. I'm sure you've all seen this before, but just to make sure everybody's up to speed. C1, C2, C3, C4 are the 4 contact times. C1 is the start of the partial eclipse. C4 is the end of the partial eclipse. C2 is the start of totality, and C3 is the end of totality. Those only apply if you're in the central path. If you're outside the central path, all you will ever see is the partial phases of the eclipse. And in the middle there, I've shown something called maximum eclipse, and that's when the sun is lying deepest, or we are in the deepest in the shadow of the moon. So the sun is centered behind the moon, if you will. And photographically, that's a somewhat important moment to know about. Eye protection and solar filters. So just to really clarify this, C1, if you're looking at the sun, have your eclipse glasses on, have your solar filters on. At C2, your eclipse glasses are on with one little caveat that I'll come back to. And once we're fully into C2, i.e. the sun is fully obscured, you may take them off. And you need to take them off, otherwise you will see nothing. You can leave them off all the way through to C3, after which you should put them back on. For your camera, your filter's on up until the moments before C2. And the general advice is don't take the filter off the camera, or don't take the lens cap off the camera, or if you're not using a filter, you may just leave the lens cap on. No more than 1 minute before C2, and replace it no more than 1 minute after C3. And at that point, there's so little of the sun's photosphere left exposed that your camera sensor will be okay. If you want to be extra cautious, you may want to wait until around 20 seconds before second contact, or put it back on 20 seconds after C3. And then, of course, during the remaining partial phases, you're going to have your eclipse glasses on to observe the sun. You will have your solar filter on your camera. Okay. So now we'll look at some of the phenomena that we might want to photograph, I'm focused mostly around totality. So this is the one thing I'll show you around partial phase. So we'll look at a few images, we'll look at the phenomena, then we'll jump into Photo Ephemeris, look at the simulator, and I'll give you a sense of how these things evolve and they come and go over time. Because that's one of the critical things you need to have well understood before you try to photograph this thing. So this was a photograph from last October's annular eclipse. So this was where the moon wasn't quite close enough to Earth to fully obscure the sun. This was taken slightly more than halfway through the period from C1 to C2. And you may be able to see here there is a sunspot that's about to be covered by the moon. You may also notice that this limb of the moon, it's I saw something again last night that finally clarified why it's called the limb and not the edge. A limb is the apparent edge of a spherical object. So you'll hear references to the lunar limb or the solar limb. You'll hear talk of limb darkening. That's applied to the sun, where you may be able to see that as the curve of the sun is turning away from us, the viewer, it appears slightly darker in our photographs. That's limb darkening. And then the lunar limb with its valleys and mountains, which causes a lot of the phenomena we'll talk about today. That's this roughness here that you can see, particularly there, for example, and a little bit here as well. There's a little valley, a little peak there. I've got a variety of solar filters. I'll briefly recap those. If you've missed previous webinars, they're covered in detail in those, and I'll provide a link to the replays of those webinars at the end today. This was taken with a solar filter by a company called Nisi. It's a 16.6 ND plus UV plus IR solar filter. It's not just an ND filter, it's a solar filter. That said, it's not one that is intended to protect your eyesight. So don't look through the optical viewfinder of your DSLR through this filter at the sun. It'll do your eyes no good at all. A lot of you are, I know, are very keen to hear about exposure settings, and I'm going to talk about them in some detail, but I want you to take ownership of your own exposure settings and to do some additional research after this to make sure you understand how your equipment behaves. It may not be the same as the equipment that I'm used to using. And indeed, solar filters do vary. So they're not going to all need the same exposure. And if you use this exposure on a different filter, you may end up wildly under or overexposed. So make sure you test it out yourself. However, that said, I tend to shoot at f8. And everything I'm going to talk about this morning exposure-wise is at f8. And other than this photo where I was at ISO 400, mostly I'm at ISO 100 in the remainder of this presentation. But this was the exposure. It was a 500mm lens on a full frame DSLR. When I took it into Lightroom, I was able to crank the exposure up by around 2/3 of a stop without blowing out any highlights. If you're familiar with digital cameras, you'll know that one of the worst things you can do is blow out the highlights because then there is nothing recoverable. So it's one of those contradictory things where you'll hear advice to expose to the right, but don't blow the highlights. And if you're worried about that, then just back it off a little bit, and even if you're a little bit underexposed, you can recover detail out of the shadows or the slightly underexposed area, but you can't recover anything from a blown out highlight. It's basically all on, it's all ones, digitally speaking, and there's no detail to recover there. So that's the partial phase. This was later, and you'll see for some reason, I tweaked my shutter speed. I lengthened it slightly to a 3300th of a second. And so this was slightly less underexposed. So it shows there's a little bit of latitude. But the key message here is, I think, that you don't really need to be varying your exposure during the partial phases of the eclipse. You can find the right one that works, lock in on it, and just keep using it. When you're focusing, I'm not going to talk too much about focus today, but there are a few considerations on how to do it. You probably want to use a tight focus pattern on your camera, so you'll use a single focusing cell. Don't let it sort of roam around. focus in on the edge. You want the high contrast edges. That's what the autofocus will be best at picking up. And one thing you might consider, I'm not going to talk about it in detail today, but a lot of people say focus during partial and don't mess with it during total. And that's okay. You can do that. I always tend to be a little bit paranoid and think, well, if I knock something or move something or adjust something, and then I photograph the whole of totality and I'm slightly out of focus, then disaster, I have nothing usable. So a few things you can think about doing. Some advice that we had from Michael Zala, who was on the last webinar, was to, which he had received in fact from Fred Espenak, is to focus during partial, tape down your focus ring. Now I think that taping down consideration is that makes me a little bit nervous, because then I think, oh my goodness, what if I go wrong and I have to rip the tape off? And so, yeah, I don't know. You might like that idea, so have a look at that. Another is to set up your camera to use what's called back button focusing. So most DSLRs, when they come, the focus is, autofocus is tied into the shutter release. So you half press the shutter and it focuses and does the metering if you're in that's one of the exposure modes that is other than manual. So that means that every time you press the shutter, your camera's, if you've left autofocus on, it's trying to refocus. That's probably not what you want during totality. So another option is to use what's called back button focusing, where you decouple the autofocus function from the shutter release. And so on my camera here, and many of them will be the same. Hopefully you can see that just there. There's an AE on button here, and you can go into the settings and set it so that the autofocus only happens when you press that AE on, but AF on, sorry, AF on, not AE on. It only focuses when you press that, and then you can shutter release as you will, and it won't try to refocus. So that's another thing you could look into. So let's talk about the total eclipse. During the total eclipse, there are a whole bunch of things we're going to be able to see in photograph. This one shows a few of them. So this was taken at third contact, but the same thing happens at second contact, just in reverse. And this is showing the diamond ring, part of the corona. So this is the corona, the outer atmosphere of the sun. The diamond ring is not caused by the corona, it's caused by the photosphere, which is the light producing, the principal light producing part of the sun. It's what's left that's not quite covered up, and the light converges, if you've seen this before, usually to a single point, sometimes to a couple or even 3 points. And that convergence, when it appears like this in a photograph, is called the diamond ring. You may also see little hints of pink just here. That is the hint of what's called the chromosphere, and we'll look at that in more detail in the next shot. Here's the exposure for this photograph. F8, ISO 100, 125th of a second. That's what I used on that. And it didn't need much adjustment in post. This is not my photograph. I'll tell you why I'm using a NASA photograph, which is kindly licensed for folks like me to use and like you to use. It's because last time I tried to photograph this 2017 eclipse, I missed all of this. And that's one of the key things I'm hoping to avoid this time, and why I've done a lot of the things I've done in the software to try to prepare for it. So these things happen really quickly. You've got to be right with your timing, your preparedness, and your exposure to get it right. So this one here is f10, so slightly smaller aperture, ISO 125, 500th of a second. So shorter exposure. And this photograph is up on Flickr. It's up on a few places as a NASA site. You can download it. And the exposure information is posted here. So one tip is, if you're interested in seeing what the different exposures, what effects the different exposures have on photographs and how they appear, come to Flickr. There's a whole load of stuff on here that has the exposure information built in. Bear in mind, you don't know what was done to it in post necessarily, but it'll give you a sense of the sorts of settings that people can use. So it's an interesting thing to explore. Next, this is one of our photographs from 2017. It's showing the chromosphere. You can see the pink there very clearly. It's showing a prominence. There's a prominence there. There's a hint of one there. There's what looks like a sort of small loop prominence there. There are some more here, and there's part of the exposure of the corona that's showing up there as well. There's a lot more corona that isn't appearing in this photograph due to exposure. So this is the exposure, f8, ISO 100, 250th of a second. So it's important to note that in this one, there is no photosphere of the sun. So you don't need your eye protection. You don't need your solar filter on here. There's these beads, that's photosphere. This is not photosphere. If it were, it would be that blinding bright light. And so we can lengthen our exposure somewhat for this. Here, though, this is taken right in the middle between C2 and C3, so approximately at the point of maximum eclipse. And a few things happen there. We'll look at this in the simulator. One is that predominantly all you're really seeing is corona. You can see a tiny hint of pink there. And if I go back to this photograph, you might conclude, oh, look, that's what's left of that prominence. And indeed it is. And one important thing to note is that that prominence is the tallest from the edge of the photosphere, chromosphere outward. And at this point in maximum eclipse, it's the only one that's really still visible. Now, this is a half-second exposure. So we've gone from here a 250th to a half-second. And when you do that, you can see how much further the chromosphere actually extends beyond the limb of the moon here. So hopefully you're getting a sense that there's a big variety of exposures that you're going to be using during the eclipse. One thing conceptually to think about is that arguably, whether you're looking at Baily's beads or a diamond ring, it's sort of a question of exposure more than anything else. This was another photograph from the annular last October, and this is showing, you can see that is beading at third contact. There's tiny little glimpses of a photosphere there, but it's with a solar filter on the camera, so there is no sort of flare. They don't appear bright, they don't flare out. This is an exposure that's correct for Baily's beads. It's just before C2, shorter exposure. This is one of Alice's photos at C3 from 2017, but it's a longer exposure. Again, no solar filter. And there you're seeing that flaring. We're seeing a little bit of diffraction spikes here, I guess, from the lens. That's from it being at f8. You may want to open up your aperture to avoid those if you don't like them aesthetically. It's a point Alan Dyer makes in his book. I do quite like them personally, and I think if you want to call it the diamond ring, I think the little spikes actually contribute to that visual illusion. But again, exposure is everything. So let's look at the timing of these things. I'm going to jump over to the web app. So this is at app.photoephemeris.com, and I thought Texas is getting all the attention in this eclipse, so I'm going to ignore Texas this time around. And we're coming to, is that Illinois or is that Missouri? It's close. I should have checked. But anyway, there's an interesting little spot here called Park Hills. I've never been there. I don't know anybody who lives there. But it's interesting because it's close to the edge and it shows us a few different things. So one thing you can do to explore locations, I've come to April 8th. Up here, there is a list of more solar eclipses than any of us will ever witness, all from the year 1600 to 2500. Choose the one you want. It's probably April 8th. So that's what's loaded. The path is shown here. Pink is the central path. You can be anywhere within the central path and see totality. If you're outside of it, you will not see totality. If you're near the edge, things get a little bit more marginal. Your duration in totality shortens. it takes a long time to shorten. It stays considerable for most of the path, and then it shortens very quickly as you approach the edge of the path. So the advice is, if you want to be sure of seeing totality, stay 3, 4, 5 miles within the path. If you are super experienced and have seen these before and like seeking out edge phenomena, then by all means go closer, but do your research. Here in the timeline, you can see we've got first contact, a few other things going on, second max eclipse, third, fourth contact. If I click to second contact, the mini simulator up here, which is available with the subscription, shows you what you're going to see, and we'll look at that in a little bit of detail. But what I'll do, I'm going to click here, and I'm going to go back a few seconds. There we are. Then I'm going to click here to expand the simulator. And when you expand the simulator, it basically swaps places with the map. So the map's still there. You can drag and drop the pin and just move around, see what your effect your location has on duration and appearance of the eclipse. But I'll leave it in this place because what I want to look at today is what happens when, of all these phenomena we've talked about. So I'm going to go here. This little diamond will take us to 5 seconds before C2. Now, let's go back another 10 seconds, just to around a minute before. So a minute before, the simulator is more or less looking as if it has a solar filter on the camera. That's programmatic. It's how it's written. And programmatically, I take the filter off at around 20 seconds before second contact. So if you were photographing through a filter, this is the sort of thing you would see. One thing I'll point out, let me just advance a little bit here, is that you see here where these are called the cusps, and the cusps are where the moon is advancing over the sun and it's disappearing to nothing. So you can see it at the cusps. You can see the effect of the lunar limb already. If I zoom right in on there, you see how that's almost broken there. So it is possible, if you're good with your timing and you leave your filter on close to C2, that you can photograph some of that little cusp beading as you get there. I wouldn't worry too much about it though, if this is your first eclipse or one of the few that you've seen. But just so you know it's there, I'll advance a little bit more. We're 25 seconds before C2, and at this point, my simulator is sort of taking the filter off, and we start seeing the same sorts of effects that we saw in the photograph. So you've got some corona, some diamond ring, little hint of pink chromosphere, and some beading going on there. And if I let that play through, this is just playing through in real time. So we're 10 seconds before, there's beads, so they're getting emphasized programmatically a little bit. And then we're coming to C2 here, the countdown 2, 1, and we are there. So it's C2. So at that point, you can take you don't need to observe with eclipse glasses. Your filter should already be off your camera. But just look at that again, how quick that was. From 20 seconds before, filters off, everything's developing. You're getting chromosphere, you're getting beads, you're getting corona. We hit C2, and then things change a little bit. So I'm going to zoom in here so you can sort of see what's going on. See this tiny bit of chromosphere there? Now we're advancing through into totality, and what happens is that as the moon is moving across the sun, the chromosphere is also getting obscured. So your time to photograph chromosphere is around C2 and around C3. As we approach maximum eclipse, I'll pause that, hit max. This is when you're really focusing on the corona. The chromosphere is largely gone. There may be some prominences visible, particularly in this eclipse, because we're approaching the solar maximum where the activity of the sun is at its highest. More sunspots, more prominences, more flares, and possibly coronal mass ejections, which is where the solar flare is directed out into space, sometimes at Earth, which causes the aurora. But we may see some of these in this eclipse, and if we were to see one, there isn't one in this simulator is using one of my photographs from 2017. There was no CME visible, but sometimes you may see a little sort of eddy. It's like sort of like a tulip head almost type shape, sort of out from the limb of the sun here, and look, you can look for those. They've been observed before. They were drawn in 1860 in an eclipse. They've been photographed since, and indeed one was photographed in April of last year in the hybrid solar eclipse in Australia. So that's an interesting thing to look for. We click through to C3. One of the reasons I chose this location is because C3, that's third contact, but look here, there's already some beads visible. So if I go back 10 seconds, they're gone. Let me play that and watch how they move, they emerge there. So we're 5 seconds before the official C3 time, what's called the standard or the classical contact time, which assumes that the limb of the moon is smooth, but it's not smooth, and so the sun gets to peek through the valleys a little bit sooner in this case than it otherwise would. And if I click the simulator into this mode, you can see why that is. This orange line is an exaggerated vertical profile of the lunar limb. The blue is the classical smooth limb, the reference value. You can see that there are valleys at this point, and here's where these beads are emerging. But look at the timing. We're 5 seconds before C3. So as a photographer, you have to be ready with the right exposure set to capture that. If you're still on your corona settings and you photograph that, it's going to be way overexposed. So you're probably going to need to adjust your exposures before C3. So in that period between max eclipse and C3, you need to say, how long do I have? Get ready, adjust the exposure. We'll talk about this in great detail shortly. But let me just play that through. So there's C3. Here are the beads. You can see the chromosphere is emerging again here. I don't show the corona in this view just so we get a really clear view of the beads. Here we are, 10 seconds. Now that's bright. You're not going to be looking at that with your eyes. You would want to look at this for most a couple of seconds with the naked eye. 20 seconds after, and so on and so forth. So that's how it progresses. So let's come back here. I'm going to skip back, briefly talk about solar filters. You may have seen these slides before. I used them a couple of weeks ago, but I want to emphasize a few things. There are multiple solar filters. They give a slightly different appearance to the sun, and they may require different exposures based on the material that's used in the filter. So it's important for you to test with your solar filter and work out what exposure is appropriate for the one that you choose to buy. There are some options here. Barter film, it's like a mylar with, I think, with aluminum sprayed on it, I think. I'm not an expert in that. This Nisi filter is a glass filter, different material again. This is a solar filter sheet. You can buy that for around $15–16 for a 6x6 sheet, and just tape it around the end of your lens, if you will. It gives this orange color. It's artificial color. It's not the natural color of the sun. This is the closest to the natural color. It's slightly on the creamy side rather than pure white, but that's closest. But the exposures differ. So test. This is a little bit more. This is a different solar filter. Here it is. This is the one I'll probably use on the day. You can see that. That's 1000 Oaks optical. And it fits over the end of your camera lens. It's got felt on the inside here. You push it on, you can pull it off quickly. That's one of the key advantages, is the quick removal and replacement of the filter just before C2 and replacement after C3. But again, different exposure, different optical qualities. This one's slightly sharper, but I've been getting some decent results with the 1000 Oaks as well, so I'm probably happy to use that. If you don't like the color of the Barda, you can recolor it in post. This is the same image, just recolored in Lightroom using standard tools, so it's very easy to do if you like the orange color. Okay, that's enough of partial phases. Let's talk about going from before C2 to after C3. We are at T minus 60 seconds before C2. Your filter is on. There may be some beading at the cusps, which you may be able to pick up if you are interested to try and capture that, but you're doing it with filters on. Sometime between T minus 60 and T minus 20, hence the little approximate sign, you're taking your filter off the camera and you are adjusting your exposure settings. We'll talk about from what to what shortly. And our photographic focus here is for Baily's beads and the diamond ring. That is a question of primarily of timing and exposure. The closer you are to C2, the finer the beads will become if you're going to see beads in your location. It varies by location. The smaller they'll become, but also if you get a shorter exposure, the better defined they will be in the final image. If you are overexposed, you'll get more of that flary diamond ring sort of appearance. At C2, from just before to few seconds afterwards, it'll vary by location, so tested in the simulator. You're photographing prominences and chromosphere along with corona. As we approach maximum eclipse, then you're looking for primarily corona, the extended corona, i.e. photographing it with a longer exposure. You may also be able to look for coronal mass ejections. There may be some large prominences still visible, could well be this time around. And you may also wish to widen your field of view and photograph planets, stars, and comets, which will be vaguely in the vicinity. I'm not going to talk about that today because I'm focusing on the real telephoto stills photographic plan today. But be aware that that is also a possibility. And then we basically go through the reverse of all of that. So it's just the same thing happening in the different order. A couple of comments I'll make. I think it's a common experience that C2 takes people by surprise. It comes quicker than you're thinking. So being ready for the timing is critical. C3, and hopefully you've taken a bit of time here to stop and look at the eclipse, maybe with binoculars during totality, nowhere near C2 or C3, unless it's got the filters on. And also look just with the naked eye and look around you. So take that time. Generally, you'll be feeling better prepared for C3, and you also get a better sense of it coming. It's you sort of see things brightening again. Your eyes tuned in, you're dark adapted, you're more sensitive to that change. So C3 is a little bit easier to handle in terms of the timing. But again, things happen quickly, particularly if you're in a shorter duration location. And then we're off doing the reverse of what we were doing here and getting our filter back on the camera within a minute of C3 occurring. Okay. Exposure settings. So this is a combination of my experience, online guidance, particularly from Fred Espinak's site and Alan Dyer's book. It's a synthesis of all of these sources plus others. And to talk about exposure settings, the way I think about it, you are not obliged to think about it the way I think about it at all, but here's some guidance. I want to change as little as possible because there's enough going on. There's a ton of sensory overload, lots of things to look at. I don't really want to miss anything, unlike 2017. I want to get beads before C2, all of that. But I want to be flexible, just in case conditions have changed. Maybe there's some thin high cloud that still allows us to photograph these things, but we have to adjust the exposure a little bit, or we have to have the flexibility already built into our exposure plan. But that's how I sort of think about organizing it. So for filters on beads at the cusps, you're looking at, I'm assuming always f8, ISO 100. These would change if you change these numbers here. But a 5,000th to 1,000th-ish, you need to test it with your filter because it changes. Filter off for Baily's beads is really quite short exposures to get that definition in the bead. So an 8,000th to 2,000th. Sometimes online, you're going to be seeing exposures guidance at a 4,000th. I think a lot of these listings max out at 1/4,000th because that was the shortest shutter speed you could achieve with many SLRs. That's no longer the case with modern SLRs, and certainly not with mirrorless cameras. Um, some of the latest mirrorless cameras will go to 1/32,000th of a second. So I don't know if you need that or not, but you can go that. But I'm showing sort of an 8,000th to a 2,000th. For the diamond ring, based on Alice's shots, we were at, what was it, 2/50th or something, so 500th to 100th. For the chromosphere and the prominences, a lot of the online guidance I read is around a 2,000th or a 1,000th at these settings. But I'm getting it quite nicely exposed at a 2/50th. So there's a range there. And different eclipses will give you different results based on the circumstances and your location and the clarity of the sky, all sorts of things. And then finally, the corona, you very much want longer exposures for that. So anything from 1/250th to 1 second or even more. So Fred Espenak's site says up to 4 seconds at f8 and ISO 100 for the extended corona, and the corona is extending up to 8 times the radius of the sun. So it's quite an extended phenomena. So that's from your field of view consideration. Don't necessarily go too tight if you want to capture all that. Otherwise, you'll end up cutting off the edge of the corona in the shot, which may not be what you want. How to do this? Exposure bracketing, auto bracketing. So most cameras have this, not all, but most. If your camera doesn't have it, it's fine. All you're going to be doing is doing a progression from shorter to longer, back to shorter exposures through the eclipse. The only thing we're going to really aim to change, or the only thing I suggest you want to change, two things. One, obviously take your filter off at the right time and put it back on when you need to. And secondly, adjust your shutter speed. Otherwise, leave it alone. If you have auto bracketing, then you can set your camera to take a sequence of shots, and normally you'll have it set in a continuous shooting mode, so you can hold your shutter release or the shutter down, and it will take between 3 to 9 shots in a sequence, and it will automatically vary the exposure by changing the shutter speed to vary it by plus or minus 1 stop, or on some cameras you can vary it to say a third of a stop, or 1.7 stops, or 2 stops. I think 1 stop is probably the best option. It gives you a good range of exposure, and it avoids putting the exposures too far apart, so that if you wish to blend them afterwards to create a HDR composite, you've got a good sequence to work from. So I'm thinking of doing up to 9 frame bracketed sequences at 1 frame apart. Here's just on the back of my camera, this is, you can set it to 3, 5, 7, or 9, and it sort of shows you visually the auto exposure bracketing. So with this setting, it's going to take a base exposure, so that's going to be at f8 1/500th at ISO 100, and it'll take it exactly there. Then it'll work through these other 4 exposures at +1, +2, -1, -2 stops, and the shutter speed is what will be varied as that happens. This is a sequence from 2017. So the base exposure was ISO 100, f8, an 80th of a second, and 9 frames. And this is how they come out. This is without any adjustment in post-production. And you can see it goes from, that's a good exposure. I think these two are good for chromosphere prominences. This is getting a reasonable amount of extended corona, all in one sequence. So you're not having to adjust exposure manually, you're simply setting it up and taking the sequence. So this is sort of the grand summation of all of that, if you will. So the way I'm thinking about it is I might want to look at doing 2 different bracketed exposure sets. Now, this is only a suggestion, so please evaluate this for yourself, think it through, research it against other sources and recommendations and your own experience, and see whether you think it might work for you. Most cameras, if they support bracketing at all, will support certainly up to 7 frames of bracketing. It's unlikely that your camera does bracketing but only does 3 or 5 frames. I suppose it's possible. I don't know if there are any that do that. But I'm showing sort of a few different options here. So there are 2 sets of bracketed exposures. There's one that does all of these phenomena, filters off Baily's beads, diamond ring, chromosphere, and prominences. and one that's really focused on the corona. And I'm thinking that I will have a setup for pre-C2 to post-C2. I'll then switch over to this setting for maximum eclipse, and then I'll switch it back to this setting for the phenomena going through C3. And the key thing is that if you've evaluated the phenomena you're particularly interested in capturing, you can say, well, what is the best base exposure for what my photographic priorities are? And these are the ones that are highlighted here. So if you were on a 3-bracketed set, unlikely but possible, and you really wanted to get Baily's beads, you might set it at f8 ISO 100 4,000th and take that set. Or you could set it at 1,000th and take a 5-bracketed set or a 7-frame set, which will cover a whole bunch of these things. Or with 9 frames, you get all the way down there. So here you can see in this region, we've got overlap between what's good for corona versus what's good for everything else, which is nice. So if you can go to 7 or 9 frames, I think that's a good idea. They're going to be pretty quick sequences to take. For the corona, you remember I mentioned going through to 1, 2, or even 4 seconds. So if you set a base exposure of an 1/8 with a 9-frame sequence, you can get everything from a 60th, 1/25th, all the way through to 2 seconds in one go. Okay. We're going to switch gears now, but I'm going to have to take a quick look in at questions. We've got about 25 minutes of the scheduled time left. So Ken asks, does the corona change during the period C2 to C3? I think a few things happen, Ken. Your eyes become more dark adapted, so you tend to see more if you're looking at it with the naked eye. That's one thing that happens. 2 is that the contrast overall reduces because the beads have gone. Therefore, there's not blindingly bright photosphere competing with much darker chromosphere, corona rather. Think of the corona as sort of being the brightness of the full moon, roughly. It's a huge difference. So your eyes get better at seeing it. You're not having to deal with as much contrast photographically. It doesn't really change markedly, I don't think, during the short period of totality. Obviously, the sun is moving through the sky. The parallactic angle is changing, stuff like that. But those are very, very small changes. Can ask, given the distance from the moon to the sun, will one focus setting get sharp edge on both moon and sun? I believe that is correct. I haven't done the calculation, but yes, you can just focus on the limb and you'll be good. So Peter, hopefully we've answered your question around, Peter was asking, if I practice exposure when looking directly at the sun well before the eclipse through appropriate filters and eye protection, will that roughly map into what I need before C2? The answer is it may depend on your filter, but I think, if I just go back here, let's look at this slide quickly. Where was it? Yes, this one, yeah. So you can see there is overlap there between my filter on exposure and my filters off exposure for Baily's beads. So the answer is yes. It might, but you do need to test your filter to see if that is the case. Abedin asks, hi Abedin, we've been corresponding this week. What is the delta T in the playback window of the Eclipse simulator? Let me quickly answer that. Delta T, that's this number here. If you're an Eclipse chaser and you really care about these things, you probably stay aware of something called delta T. Delta T is, there's a time reference frame that is used by astronomers to calculate the position of the sun and the moon, the stars, everything else astronomical. And then there is the time frame that we use here on Earth as normal human beings. The one that we use is the astronomical reference frame doesn't take account of the rotational speed of the Earth. The one that we use does, because we care when the sun comes up and when the sun goes down. So delta T is the difference between those two time frames. And it's basically, it changes over time. It's not entirely possible to predict it analytically. There are people that measure it. The delta t value basically tells you how these eclipse contact times were calculated. If delta t changed by a second, the path of the eclipse would shift one way or the other, east or west, slightly. So it's a detail. It's provided primarily for comparability with other sources, so that if you say your simulator is saying C2 is happening at exactly 158, 40.3 seconds, and somebody else says 40.8 seconds, you can work out whether it's because of a difference in delta t or because of a difference in the calculation. Hopefully that's it's probably too much information. Apologies. Will I get away with an exposure of, Daniel asks, an exposure of 8 seconds tracked at 500 mil, or will the corona be too large and out of frame? I'd have to work it out. I'm not entirely sure. You certainly could go for 8 seconds. That will get you as much corona as there is to be had, I suspect. I'm assuming your other settings are compatible with it. Can be harder to combine those. You have to work out what to do about the edges of the moon when you try to combine those exposures with other exposures because of movement over the course of 8 seconds. Plus, you're reducing the number of exposures you'll get because of the duration. So, okay, I'm going to move on, and I'll come back to other questions later. So let's see. Now I've got to do a few little changes. So hopefully you can now see my iPhone. I've got it on the camera so you can see what I'm doing with my hand here on the on my picture, and then the screen share there. So I've got the app set up at the same location, and there's a new version of the Photo Ephemeris iOS that's been released just this week. Look for version 4.14. It's rolling out now in the App Store. If you haven't seen the update already, you will in the next handful of days at most. And it adds a new event countdown and notification function, which I'm going to show you. So to access it, use my right hand here. I tap this info button at the bottom right of the map, and primarily this is a vertical view of the timeline. So it shows you all the timeline events that you have configured on the one that's displayed below the map. But you'll see on the right here, it's giving you the event times with more precision than you can see in the timeline itself. Now, for some events like sunrise, it's a little bit meaningless to quote a time of 6:36 and 5 seconds AM, because sunrise, the precise time of sunrise varies based on the atmospheric refraction. That said, the app still has to calculate the time, and that is the time it will use if you configured an event notification for sunrise. So I show it with a little tilde to show that those are sort of approximate, i.e. the precision exceeds the expected accuracy, if that makes sense. But for eclipses, it's good to be able to see the exact time. So you can compare it with other sources. You see, should I trust the times that this app is giving me versus somebody else's, or vice versa? You can compare it to the nearest tenth of a second. So second contact at 158, 40.3 seconds, for example. At the top, there's the event countdown and notification function, and there's a notification status entry beneath it. Let me show you that first. So there are a few ways to use this, but typically you're going to want, or you may wish to have the event notifications announcing the key things that are happening for the eclipse or for other situations. So you can test that here. On a clean install, the first thing you're going to be asked to do is to authorize the app to send you notifications. So there'll be a button you can click authorize, and then if you want to, you can say yes, authorize notifications. You can test the notifications there. And then you can come into rehearsal mode or live mode. And I'm just going to rewind a few seconds before second contact. And I have this set up for this location in Illinois, wherever that was. And I can play down the countdown. And were I not sharing the screen with you, the notifications would sound. and you'll hear those shortly. But it'll give you a countdown with notifications a minute before, 30 seconds before, a standby at 15 seconds, and then C2 has happened. It'll give you max eclipse notifications and C3 notifications as well. So we can see what notifications have been scheduled here. These are obviously rehearsal notifications, so the eclipse isn't happening right now. I've just got it set to a future date on April 8th, but this is when they're going to play on my device today. There was a whole article on how to use this. Let's jump into it. On the day, you can go into live mode, and that will be set for the current time and what's happening right now. So this will be live for the eclipse. But the intention is that you would use this in advance and do your practice and rehearsal with it. So that's this. I think it'll be easier to see when I share the video, and then you'll be able to hear the notifications because I won't be sharing the screen. What we're going to do, we did something similar to this last time, but it was for a rather specialized eclipse circumstance. But this time what we'll do, okay, hopefully you can see that video screen there. So what I have set up here is a couple of things. Same location that we looked at before for the eclipse in Illinois. So it's a relatively short duration eclipse, but it shows all of these phenomena. We're going to play the simulator, and it's going to show you the standard simulation. As I play the video, we should see the outline view up here. I composited it in on the video. And on the right here, you will see the countdown timer and the notifications coming up. Now, if I click share sound, I want to make sure you can hear this. So what I was going to try and do was sort of roughly show you what I have to do here. I'm going to turn my blur off on my video, and I'm going to attempt to show you what happens or what I need to be doing as this eclipse occurs. So I have bracketing off on my camera. I have my solar filter on. Okay, let's play. Let's see where we get to. Okay, there we go. I'm clicking play. We're 1 minute 20 before second contact. So my filter is on. I'm not bracketing. I'm shooting continuous high, but not bracketed. I've set my exposure to whatever it is, 5,000th of a second, f/100.
And contact in 60 seconds.
60 seconds to second contact. That was the notification. Hopefully you heard that. Oh yeah, Alice reminds me, you can make my picture larger by dragging the sidebar in Zoom if you want to see what I'm doing up here with the camera. So now I'm taking my last filtered photographs, and I'm thinking about taking my filter off. But before I take the filter off, I'm enabling 9-frame bracketing, and I'm reducing
in 30 seconds.
My shutter speed. I'm taking my filter off. 30 seconds to second contact. So now I'm set up for bracketing. I've got my back button autofocus here. Right. Hopefully you might be able to hear that. I'm shooting bursts to get these diamond rings and Baily beads. You can see the beads there. Diamond ring is formatted.
5, 4,
Here we go.
3, 2, 1.
Okay. We're into second contact. I'm going to keep shooting, and I'm going to keep shooting a few seconds into this with the same settings. Some more. Okay. We got 38 seconds to max eclipse. I'm going to adjust my shutter speed.
Maximum eclipse in 30 seconds.
I'm at an 1/8, which is the one I think we said. And now I'm set for a bracketed sequence for the corona. I'm going to shoot. Now, you might be able to hear this.
Stand by.
Here it's they're longer times because there's longer shutter speeds. So I'm shooting for maximum eclipse. I've got my corona shots.
Maximum eclipse in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Done. Okay. Now I'm going to take a few seconds and I'm going to look. I'm going to look at the eclipse. I'm going to look up. I'm going to look around. soak it in, enjoy the moment. This is a short one though, so we don't have long. So now I'm going to change my shutter speed
Third
back
contact in 30
to
seconds.
the shorter setting that I want for my third contact phenomena. So that's back to the one I had before. All I had to do is change the shutter speed, nothing else. And I'm shooting just to check everything's well.
Stand by.
We've got some corona, we've got a standby. If you look here in this simulator, watch for the beads coming up here.
Third contact in 5,
There they are.
4,
Shoot.
3, 2, 1.
Lots of bursts. Get as many shots as you can, because these things, they change so quickly. You can see them changing. Okay, we're not looking at the sun with our naked eyes. It's too bright. The camera's still okay.
15 seconds past third contact.
But now I'm thinking, okay, it's probably time to get my filter back on. Got my filter. Filter's back on. I'm turning bracketing off.
30 seconds past third
I'm
contact.
shooting again with filter. Okay. And it's sort of over. I'm going to pause that there. You can see that I'll just let this last notification play out. So we're coming up to a minute past third contact. And by now you need your filter back on that camera or a lens
60
cap.
seconds past third contact.
And then it's lined up for the next set of notifications at fourth contact. Okay. So we'll pause that. So what I'll do now, let me look for any questions that have come in. Hopefully it sort of gives you a real sense for how this thing is going to go. Your eclipse is not going to be my eclipse. This is how I'm thinking about doing it. You should have your own plan. You should rehearse it. Rehearse photographing the full moon, a rising moon. That's one of those sort of time intense moments as well. Photograph the sun uneclipsed. Practice all of this. Make sure you're using your equipment at the right angle. So you can look for dates when the moon is going to be as high as the sun will be on eclipse day, and check the ergonomics of your equipment. Check you can see the screen, that you can access everything, focus, etc. And run these timers. So take a moon, like there's a new moon today. You could go out on Sunday or Monday evening, try to photograph that crescent new moon, get your focus locked in, and run the timers on the app to get a sense of how quickly things are going to happen for you in your location, given the things that you want to photograph. So with that, let me look for some more questions here. So we've got a few minutes left. So yeah, I answered that one. Yeah, that is true. So Marv says on the bracketing recommendation, it's going to depend if the bracketing setup is 0 minus plus or 0 plus minus versus 0 minus 0 plus. Get that right. So sometimes you can have the bracketing set up to change the order or change the offset of the exposures. I was looking at a symmetrical bracketed set, so the same number of exposures plus as minus. So just be careful on that if you're setting your camera. Practice, try it, see what you get. Upload the photographs, look at the metadata, make sure it did exactly what you expected it to do. Let's have a look. Do you leave glasses on during the diamond ring phase? I think it's very unlikely for me as a photographer that I would leave them on, because I will be looking at my camera and not at the sun at that point. And I want to photograph it. I'm not fussed about it. The advice is not to look at the diamond ring or Baily's beads for more than 2 to 3 seconds without eye protection. So you could have a glance up. A lot of people will say, don't even bother at C2, because if you do so, you'll blind yourself and then you won't be able to see what's going on during totality. But at C3, if you want to have a look at it with the naked eye, you can do it for 2 or 3 seconds, but then protect your eyes, look away, or carry on with your photography. So I think that's the guidance there, Steve. Uh, Ken says, just prior to C2, yeah, this is a fun thing to look at. Take a look at your shadow, and your own shadow on the ground. It has a crisp, not a fuzzy edge. So there's a good video on this by a gentleman called Gordon Telephone, who does lots of eclipse science. He has also an eclipse timing app and a book on eclipses, and he shows that even if you hold your hand out like that and orient it differently during the partial phases, you'll see a sharp edge shadow and a fuzzy shadow, based on the fact that the sun is no longer a disk, but there's more light vertically than horizontally, and that's what causes the difference in the sharpness. While taking pictures of the partial phases, do you use spot metering? You shouldn't have to use spot metering at all, because you shouldn't have to really meter on the day, because what I would recommend is that you take your solar filter and your camera and you go out on a sunny day, photograph the moon, work out the sun, photograph the sun, work out your exposure in advance, and use manual exposure on your camera on the day. So you don't need to do any metering. Focus is different, obviously, but metering, hopefully you don't need to. And you won't be metering during C2 or C3, because you'll hopefully be using bracketed exposure sets that work to capture the things that you want to really focus on capturing. And you shouldn't need to change the focus. I just don't trust my own eyes to focus, even if I'm looking at a screen. I trust autofocus when used correctly. So focus on high contrast edges. I'm pretty sure that in 2017 I did refocus during totality, and it was fine because there's bright corona. A lot of people say you shouldn't need to do that and not to do it, and that would probably be the official line. But do what works for you, and your eyesight could well be sharper than mine is nowadays, and you could focus manually and be happy. But you should need to change focus unless something is awry. So let me, Christopher asks, several times you indicated testing your settings filter, but the test setup to test only exists during the eclipse. Yeah, I think my emphasis on testing, Christopher, is really primarily around making sure you understand the behavior of your solar filter for the partial phases, which doesn't require an eclipse to be occurring for you to do that. You could do that today, or any day between now and eclipse day. And I think also to test that you can execute the sequence of shots you need, whether or not that's the right exposure for what's up in the sky. So it's really about rehearsal of a sequence of actions. You've seen how accelerated and compressed this activity can be. So it's important to rehearse. Peter asks, I think I may have misinterpreted the question. If I test, I may have misinterpreted your question, Peter. Sorry if I did. If I test my solar filter today directly on the sun, will that give me a reasonable exposure on the day of the eclipse prior to C2 and post C3? Yes, yes, it will. That's exactly what we recommend. Let's have a look. A more advanced question here. Stuart asked, would a Canon RA, I don't know what a Canon RA is, sorry, maybe it's a camera model with a hydrogen alpha filter installed over the sensor be beneficial in capturing the chromosphere? I don't know. I've never used the hydrogen alpha filter, but what I would say is that the one time normal folks can photograph the chromosphere without an expensive hydrogen alpha filter is during a total eclipse. So it wouldn't occur to me necessarily to be doing that on eclipse day, because you'll see it anyway. Back in 2017, when I was less well informed than I am nowadays, I looked at my photos on the back of the camera. I thought, oh my goodness, that is horrendous chromatic aberration. But no, it's not. It was the chromosphere. So you'll see that, you get it for free. You don't need an extra filter. There may be different things you can see with the filter. There may be more detail that would come out with it, but I have no direct experience, so I shouldn't really make a recommendation one way or the other. Uh, Crystal asks, excellent question. My first eclipse. Do I need to move the camera lens position during the event, or can I set it up and be done? If you're shooting wide angle, Crystal, you should set it up and let it be done, and just set it wide enough to photograph the full event from before C1 to after C4. You're probably looking at something ultra wide angle, about 16 millimeters to do that and keep the horizon in the frame. If you're in most of North America, once you get up into the Canadian provinces, it's towards the end of the path and the motion is more vertical. If you're on a telephoto lens, you will absolutely need to reframe during the partial phases. If you're on a super long focal length, and this gets a little bit, I think, to, was it Daniel's question about not clipping the corona? If you're, let's say, at 800 mil or more, chances are you will need to reframe in order not to have it move out of the frame during totality. That can be tricky if you are on a ball head, for example, on your tripod, or a pan and tilt head that isn't super smooth. That can be hard. There are two ways to deal with it. One is to use a tracker, which is a device that you mount and align, and it moves the camera for you to keep the sun in the frame centered. That's one way to do it. It's technically more complex, it's more expensive. Second way is to get a geared head that you can adjust, fine-tune, adjust with knobs, rather than having to release it, move it, tighten it, and hope it doesn't sag, which is typically the issue with ball heads and the like. Does the app timer work without cell service? Yes, it does. It's all these are local notifications. The calculations for the times are done in the app on the phone. The map is also available offline. So yes, that will work. That will work without cell service. Jason asks for a time. Yeah, Jason, I'm not going to jump into time lapse now, but Alan Dyer's book is very good on this. If you want full details on how to execute a time lapse, so I'll put that link up in a moment. Charlie asks, do I have a list of older phones that are compatible with the app? Essentially, so we only have the app on iOS, not Android. So apologies to that if you're on Android. Anything that runs iOS 15.5 or later, I believe, will do that. So I have it running on an old iPhone 7 Plus, which is pretty aged at this point. So that's a possibility. Ken asks, when using the solar filter, a bare lens or a polarizer, no polarizer. Leave your polarizers at home. You don't need it, not required. Solar filter only, or no solar filter at all. Is there info for setting up the countdown on the website? Yes, let me show you that quickly. So I'm going to switch my share back over to here. I think this is the one. Yeah, okay, so here we are. So this is the resources slide that I said I would put up. Let me quickly show you where to find the article. I'm just going to take a little shortcut to my help center here. So this is the help center. You'll find there's a link to this in the app itself as well. Help center, TP for iOS. Under general, it's the most recent article because I wrote it yesterday. Event countdown and notifications tells you how to get going with that. It shows you what's displayed, what all these little icons mean. There are a whole bunch of checks in this as well. So it'll check your clock sync to make sure your clock is set accurately. It will check your distance from what's configured in the app. There's a whole notifications settings check page as well that you can go through, and I'll put some more information online about this. It lists the notifications that are currently included, shows you what's happening in live mode. So yeah, it's up there. We'll be adding more to this over the coming days, but try it. You must rehearse with it. Don't get this out on the day and hope it's going to work out for you. That would not be advisable. You need to test it in advance. Okay, let's have a look. What else have we got? I'm happy to run on a few minutes with the questions. There aren't too many more, but let's go through. So that's Stephanie. That was your question on the countdown timer. We're good there. Charlie asks, am I using a motorized sky tracker for the photographs? None of the photographs of ours that I showed you today, Charlie, were used with a tracker. They were with a tripod and a ball head, and that worked out just fine. Bear in mind, in 2017, when I shot those photographs, I was only on a 300mm lens. So the latitude I had within my frame for the sun to move or not to be quite positioned right was greater than it's going to be this time around when I'm shooting a 100 to 400 with a 1.4 teleconverter. Some of you had asked about teleconverters in the questions in advance. And I think they're fine to use if you use a good quality one. It does limit your aperture slightly. It may reduce sharpness slightly, but the new ones, the modern ones, are generally very good. So I wouldn't go beyond a 1.4 teleconverter. I don't plan to use a tracker. We may look at a geared head. Depends how my next tests go with the ball head, and whether I can really frame it up nicely or not. Michael, I think I answered your question about Sky Tracker. My answer is not me. In the demo, Matt asks, when I shot the bursts, will these bursts result of bracketing? So when I had the bracketing turned off, Matt, and I was shooting with the filter on, that was using continuous high, which was doing some crazy 20 frames a second or something, but all at the same exposure. You don't really need to do that for the partial phases. That will be complete overkill. I'd probably go to single shots and a shutter release for that. But once the bracketing was enabled, yes, I had continuous high enabled, and it just holds down and it churns through that burst of bracketed sequence in one go. Paul asks, do I use a remote shutter? I will use a remote shutter release, yes. Probably just a simple manual one. You can get clever wireless things. I'm not sure it's necessary, really. Bracketing, please show the bracketing slide once more. By all means, let's look at that. There it is. Grab a screenshot now. Off you go. I'll post the presentation as well. I'll post it with the link to the recording. Lyle asks, how will mirror vibration affect focus? Mirror vibration shouldn't affect focus, but it may affect camera shake, which is a similar but slightly different effect. You can do mirror lockup on a DSLR. Don't lock your mirror up and take your filter off 2 minutes before totality, because your sensor's left exposed the whole time. Stick to the recommendation, don't take the filter off until less than a minute before C2, but you may want to have mirror lockup enabled so that you don't have mirror flap, particularly on a fast bracketed sequence. If you don't have mirror lockup, you may want to just go a bit more slowly with the exposures to let things settle in between times. So that's another good consideration, I think. Ryan asks, how do you access the timeline in the iOS app? Ryan, you go to, hold on, let me have a look. There is, in this article, timeline and display options. In the latest version, if you don't have the latest version, you won't see that info button there. You'll see the old one that was down here. But with 4.14, which you should be able to manually update from the App Store, or you'll get it automatically in the next couple of days. Click that button there, that info button. And when you get into it, that's the countdown timer there. It's either in rehearsal mode or live mode. It always shows one of the two. And you can check the notification status there. And you can also change your display options here for the timeline. So tap that, and that will let you, that's a much nicer way to control what's shown in the app than the old way. You can just ensure that you have everything switched on that you want and things that you don't want switched off. So you might want to switch off transit or moon phase for the eclipse day, because they can sort of get in the middle of things, and we don't really care about those on a total eclipse day. So that's that one. Bob asks, have I considered wearing a mask over one eye prior to C2 so I can be dark adapted for the corona? Yeah, I know people who've done that and recommend it, and I'm sure it can make a difference. I don't plan to do it myself. It's just feels like one thing too many to think about. But yeah, the idea is that you cover up one eye, and then when you get past C2, you remove the cover, and then you've got one eye that is fully dark adapted already, so you can get the most out of viewing the corona on those totality phenomena. It's certainly a interesting idea, and I think it does work for some people. So yeah. Intervalometer, Paul asks, yeah, you could use that for the partial phase. Definitely, I wouldn't be using it in totality. I'd want more direct control. I wouldn't want to be subject to waiting for an interval that all of a sudden I'd left set too long. But that's just me. I don't like putting too many things in the way of it. Let's have a look here. Just reading the last couple of questions. Thanks all so much for sticking around. These are excellent questions that you're all asking. So thank you again for that. Yeah, so with Canon, I'm not familiar with Canon. The last Canon camera I owned was a T70 in the 1980s. Can you believe? So, but nowadays they have presets. Marv says C1, C2, C3 custom settings, and then you just change the mode. So you can change your shutter speed and bracketing with one change on the camera. So that's an excellent tip. I don't know if it's quite that simple on the Nikon or Nikon that I have, but you're looking to minimize things that you have to change at the critical moments. Keep it simple for yourself as far as possible. So that's a good tip. C1, C2, C3 custom setting presets on Canon. Look out for that. Thank you, Marv. What about an exposure, Bob asks, to see the moon illuminated by the earth shine? That's going to be at the extreme end of your corona exposures. So the 2, 4, 8 second exposures, Bob, I think are the ones that will give you a chance of capturing earth shine. So the earth shine is the reflected light from the non-dark part of the earth reflecting back onto the moon, and you can see that or you can photograph that. I don't know if you can really see it in a total eclipse if you get a long exposure and then do some blending after the fact. Ken asks, why do you prefer the amber colored filter over the neutral? I don't prefer it. Some people do. I prefer the ability to remove my Thousand Oaks filter quickly and to replace it quickly than to screw in the other ones that I have, Ken. So that's really what I was getting at with that. You can get the color you want in post from the Bada film or from the Nissi filter for sure. Yes, it was Daniel's question about the maximum focal length you can use without risk of cropping the extended corona. I don't know the exact number, Daniel. I'd have to look it up, but it's roughly 8 times the solar radius. So that's roughly 8 times 0.5. So it's 4 degrees. You need about 4 degrees free in the direction of travel of the sun. So the last webinar showed a couple of tools for doing that. So if you look that up, let me show you the slide that has the links on. That's the auto bracketing suggestion slide, and this link here, vimeo.com/showcase/TPE-webinars, has all of our webinar replays. If I click through to that, you'll see them there, and the most recent one is at the bottom. So that's the one from 2 weeks ago. There's an alignment one there. There are a few other eclipse ones that you can see. So we'll have 4 eclipse related ones up there that cover some of these other topics. And they're all chapter marked, so you can click through to the bit that's of interest there as well if needed. Kathy says, so no polarizer filter, correct, no polarizer. Take the UV filter off as well. Yes, no UV filter. Use a solar filter or no filter. You don't need anything else. Anything else is just in the way and not doing anything to help you, really. Daniel asks again, or I think somebody else asked about that. Is it worthwhile to use an intervalometer? Yes, during partial, not during total. For me, it's not. Your mileage may vary. Jay is saying, looking at the App Store, not seeing a mention of the countdown timer. Is the new version there? Yes, it is. It's released 14. It's 4.14 is the version you want, and you should see it there. Yeah, it's definitely up there. It's definitely out there. Jay, drop me a line. Drop us a line on support or in the forum if you're still not finding it, and I'll send you a precise link. Bob asks, if you have a mirrorless camera, is it still okay to remove the filter at CT minus 20 seconds? Yes. We discussed this a couple of weeks ago with Michael Zeiler. He was with a group of a dozen or so real experts on this. They talked about it in some detail during the annular eclipse. Yes, it's okay to remove it on a mirrorless camera, just as it is on a DSLR with the mirror locked up, but not more than a minute before. That's the guidance. I might be a little bit more cautious than a minute, but I think a minute you probably find. Question from Kay Gilmore. What is the ideal speed for purchasing a memory card SanDisk Extreme Pro? I don't know about that specific model, but if you can get something 200 megabytes a second or faster, you're probably in good shape. It makes a huge difference. If you look at last time's webinar, couple of weeks ago, I demoed this. I have a really fast card in my camera, and it never buffers. Test your buffering, hold it down in continuous high, keep the shutter held down until you hear things stutter, and that's when you know you're hitting buffering. And you do not want to hit buffering at the critical moments in the eclipse. So get a fast memory card. Excellent advice. 200 megabytes per second or faster, I would recommend. David asks, am I familiar with apps such as Cam Ranger, which is a remote bracketing app? I have seen it. I haven't tried it myself, but that might well be worth looking at. There are also other software programs. There's one called Eclipse Orchestrator, and there's another called Solar Eclipse Maestro. You can look those up online, that will do full camera automation. So you can program them in advance, connect them into the USB or serial ports or remote port on your camera, run a laptop, and it'll run a script, and it'll just automate your camera for you. So you can do that. It needs plenty of practice and rehearsal and preparation, and you need to be carrying additional technology with you and have all the right cables plugged into the right holes securely at the right times. So it definitely needs setup, but you can do that. And I think Cam Ranger, and there are other ones out there that do similar things. Or there's another one I keep seeing advertised. Is it Artisan, something like that? I think it may do something similar. So yeah, you could look at those. Yes, David says, I'll be using the NISI threaded filter, but will only have it screwed in less than one turn so I can remove it quickly. So that's definitely something to think about. The other option is to say, I don't care about trying to catch last minute solar filtered photos. So take it off 2 or 3 minutes in advance, put a lens cap on, and then you can remove the lens cap quickly and replace it quickly as well. If you have a threaded filter that you're worried about being able to remove or replace shortly before C2 or quickly after C3. Ron asks, I have an iPad and an iPhone. Do I need to buy the app on each device? No. As long as you're running the same Apple ID on both devices, Ron, which the vast majority of people will be doing, you can install it on I think it's up to 5 or more devices under the same account. That's a standard for the App Store. It's not any limit that we impose upon it. With the Celestron Eclipse, Brett asks, smart universal solar filter be okay to use? I've never used a telescope, Brett, so I wouldn't wish to say either way. My understanding is if you use something like the Barda film, which you can use for cameras or telescopes, and it's fine on both. Something like the NISI solar filter may or may not be fine on both. I think that's designed for cameras. I don't know that it's designed for telescopes. It may be, but it may not be. But the Barda astrofilm, that sort of thing, definitely is. Paul asks, I have UV protectors on my lenses. Should I take them off? I would say yes, you should. They're not going to protect your camera from the unfiltered sun. You need a solar filter for that. And having them on there is simply more glass in the path. So it has potentially slight negative effect on image quality and sharpness or any imperfections in the filter. So I would not worry about that too much. James asks, will the countdown timer be available for Android? I'm afraid not, James. We don't have an Android app at the moment. I have my hands full trying to do the web app and the iOS stuff. Okay, I think we're almost through. That was a lot of questions. Thank you, everybody, and thanks for joining. And if we don't see one another, as it were, see one another before the eclipse, I hope you have a great experience and successful photography outing. Thank you for joining. Please join the forum. You can find it on the web app, top right, forum. Click there, it'll tell you how to get signed up and join there. We'd love to see you there, or send any questions via email. And thank you again. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.